Well, Thompkins, thank you so much for joining me today. We're so excited to have an opportunity to hear from you and more about your story. And as we watch the Finding Fellowship film and people learn about the community of Quince Orchard and the story that you have been such a part of in bringing communities together. And so I thought we might just start with giving you an opportunity to introduce yourself, your name, where you're from, and some background details for folks who might be watching at home.
My name is Thompkins W. Hallman. I was born in Quince Orchard on a 4-acre farm.
And when were you born, Uncle Thompkins?
January 2nd, 1924.
Which that means as of this January, how many years young?
97.
97, and still better at technology than me.
I don't know about that.
Well, thank you for hopping on virtually. I wish we were in person, but thank you for accommodating us. So tell us what it was like growing up on that 4-acre farm in Quince Orchard, started in 1924.
Well, there were early up in the morning because before I could go to school, I had to milk the cow. And then I would go home and get ready for school. And I walked from Riffelford Road to the schoolhouse.
Talk to me about what those chores were like. So you had a 4-acre farm. Did you guys have, you said you had a cow. What were the chores like? What help the children understand what life used to be like, what the responsibilities were?
Well, we had a cow, we had a horse, we had chickens, and I had all those chores to do.
Wait, you as a young man in elementary school had all of those chores before the school day even started?
Not before the school day, no. The cow I had to milk in the morning before I went to school. But then there would be after school.
All the other chores took place after school, I see. So talk to us about school. So you went to school down at the Quince Orchard Colored School, is that right?
That's right.
What was that like?
Well, we walked that mile, and along the way, there was a persimmon tree. You know what a persimmon is?
I don't. No.
That's a fruit. It's a little bitter until it gets ripe. But there was a little fruit, and we used to eat those sometimes. But I remember a particular situation that happened because we had to go to school. We didn't have snow days. We went regardless of what the weather was like. And I can remember sometimes the snow would come, I would say in October, and it would go on up and through May. And I can remember on one occasion going to a lady who lived not too far from the school. Her name was Miss Kate, and she was an elderly woman, and she had this long black hair way down on the shoulders. She was a Caucasian woman, and she would put her hand out the window and beg for us to come in, and we would go in, and she would take off her gloves, and she would rub her hands in her hair until the hands got warm, and then she'd send us on the few blocks to the school.
So she would take your gloves off and warm your hands in her hair.
Right.
That's so interesting, and it's
Okay.
Go ahead, Uncle Tompkins. Sorry, say that again.
He had beautiful long black hair, way down on the shoulders.
So what strikes me as interesting about that story is you said that that was a Caucasian woman who said
Yes.
that she would wave you in and warm your hands. Now,
Right.
but didn't you grow up in the time of segregation?
Oh, yes, yes, that's right. But the street we lived on, there was one black family. I think it was my aunt, Essie, my mother's sister, lived in a house there. And then there was another couple that lived on a farm further down going toward Germantown. And those were the only black families on that street. The rest of the families were white.
So what was that like?
Well, I can remember that there was a couple that lived on the opposite side. Um, she was Pennsylvania Dutch, and she had married an older man named Norman Gazaway, and they had two little boys. And they would come up to the house and play with my younger brothers and sisters, including Esther. And my mother would sit them down and fix lunch for them. And they had a good time until they got to be 6 years old. And then, of course, they went to separate schools.
And how did that make you feel, Uncle Tompkins?
I didn't really think very much about it at the time, but it was later on that I thought about it and I said, I guess probably when I was in high school, I thought about it and I said, it doesn't make any sense. You live in the same neighborhood, because after we started going to high school, we went to Rockville and we didn't go down 28. We took a bus going up to Germantown Road, then all the way down Germantown Road and then down 355 to Rockville. And then it made no sense to me.
This idea of segregation made no sense to you?
That's right.
So, I mean, one of the things I find interesting about your story is you then put that into action. So talk to us a little bit about your work, trying to end segregation in Washington, D.C. What did you do?
Well, I met this organization called Washington Interracial Workshop. It was a small office that I can't remember the address now. It was on F Street. And I went to the meeting. Some people that I worked with told me about it the night before. And it was very interesting because there were white people there, and there was an interracial couple there. She was white, he was Chinese, and it seemed an interesting meeting. And I started listening to them and talking about their activities, and then I became involved.
And what did becoming involved mean?
We had demonstrations at eating places, the five and dime stores, Woolworths. All of those places were segregated. You could stand at the counter, but you could not sit. And so we were picketing them, trying to get them to open up so that blacks would be able to sit just like whites did. And there was one store that was right there at 7th and E Street, Northwest. The building is still there with the Woolworths, but it's not, it's a restaurant now.
How does that make you feel now? Because you still live in Washington, D.C., and you can go around D.C. and see places that were segregated that you worked very hard to integrate. How does that affect you?
Well, I understand it now, and there's a long story as to why that was the way it was. I discovered something very different. Well, this was after that whole period that had taken place. The District of Columbia had a very liberal government back in the early days. As a matter of fact, when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation for the District of Columbia in 1962, there were as many free Blacks living in Washington as there were slaves. The District of Columbia had a city council and mayor. And they had put into effect a law in 1872-73 that barred discrimination in hotels, theaters, and restaurants, and all public places. But then that law was changed.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't imagine who changed it. A president, Woodrow Wilson.
I didn't know that.
I didn't until many years later.
So that's interesting. So DC had in many places advanced and then got pulled back. And so
Right.
like so much of the country through Reconstruction got pulled back, and this work begins anew again.
Well, let me tell you how it happened. Supposedly they were upgrading DC codes in 1910. And they think that it was left out deliberately. There was a guy who used to broadcast about it, the lost laws. He found it in the old codes, but he couldn't find it in anything after 1910. So that was a good story. I'm trying to remember her name. Mary Church Terrell. Are you familiar with her? She was from Nashville, Tennessee. And her parents had sent her to Oberlin College. She came to the District of Columbia to teach, and she married the judge, Black judge was here. And she and some people who haven't heard about this law decided to go down and test it. They went to a seafood restaurant, Thompkins seafood restaurant down at 14th and F Street Northwest to test the law. Well, they were denied service, and they appealed it. The judge said because the law had not been used all these years, he declared it invalid. They took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually put it back in effect in 1956. They said they had the right to pass it. The fact that it had not been repealed made it still valid, even though it had not been used. That I found after all these demonstrations that we'd had, that was the history. But it was not only that happened during the Woodrow Wilson administration. That was also the time in which he had the KKK march down Pennsylvania Avenue. He was one of what you would call the white supremacists. There's also another very interesting story, which has to do with Carter J. Woodson. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, I am. But before we go to that story, I'm just so curious because the parallels to the last story and now are so obvious, with a president who is going to provide a platform for white supremacists, and you and your colleagues as young activists working against that. So
Right.
what would you tell young people today who want to be active, who want to push back on this idea of white supremacy? Your story tells them that, they should get involved. What would you tell them?
Exactly. You can make a difference. Um, those were the things that we did. They were a bunch of college students. I was at college myself at the time at American University downtown school. And they came from core groups from all over the country, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Los Angeles, Pasadena, St. Louis. And they came for 1 month, July, to help us with our projects.
That's so powerful. So these were young people, these were college students who decided that they were going to make this country different.
Exactly.
It's interesting because so often people think that they can't participate, that their participation doesn't make a difference, that somebody else is going to solve the problems. And so what I really love about your story and the Quince Orchard story is that it's about normal, everyday people deciding that they're going to make their communities and their country better.
That's right.
Uncle Tompkins, you were in World War II. Um, please talk to us about that. That's such a tremendous part of our history.
I was in, I took my basic training at Fort Lee, Virginia, Petersburg, Virginia. And then I went overseas to Papua New Guinea off the coast of Australia. And I went from there to Manila, the Philippines, and then from there to Tokyo, Japan.
Wow.
So all these experiences were after I came back out of service.
And how was the service segregated or integrated by that point?
Very much so. We had all white officers, commissioned officers. The other officers were black, the sergeants.
Your soldiers, were they also your enlisted men? Were you with all races, or was it only
All
blacks?
black, all black.
All black.
Officers, white officers, black enlisted men.
Wow. And how did that experience influence, when you came back and decided to participate in these efforts to desegregate Washington, D.C.? Did that military experience affect you in that?
Well, I had a bad experience. And it was while I was still in Papua New Guinea that some of the officers changed. We started getting black officers. But then I can remember an occasion in which a chaplain, black chaplain, came over to us and was telling us about a Easter sunrise service. And there were some white chaplains, and we were supposed to have this sunrise service. And he came there, and we waited and waited and waited. And none of the white officers showed up. And then he got the message. They had came, had their service early, left home, went and left home, and didn't inform me at all. He was so disappointed.
I mean, it's such an interesting point if you think about what you said about growing up on the same neighborhood, on the same street, and yet segregated. And here abroad, fighting a common enemy, right? For a common country, and yet segregated. I mean, that had to eat at you.
Difficult, yes. Also restrictions of the whole time that we were in New Guinea. Some had been there for 3 years. They never left that base. White soldiers could go to Australia, but no blacks could go.
You know, I'm curious, I've never asked you this question before, but how did you deal with that daily injustice? That, I mean, that's why all of that happens. Those slights, the you can go, but you can't go. It's intended to break your spirit. So how did you not let your spirit get broken?
It was a case of accepting what is and recognizing there was really nothing you could do about it. I had this experience, for example, when I was at Fort Lee, coming back to Washington to come home in the service. But I knew that I'd better sit in the back of the bus when I was riding from Virginia coming back to DC. The fact that I was in the military wasn't going to make any difference in terms of the law. I'd probably be under arrest, not only by the Virginia authorities, but even by base authorities.
But see, that's so interesting and in and of itself strategic to know when you can make a difference and when you're just gonna go to prison, right? Because I feel like you came out of the service and took this collection of experiences and then found yourself at that meeting talking about integrating different spaces, talking about desegregating different spaces. You know, am I right that you ended up working with CORE?
Yes. The Rachel's workshop was a branch of CORE.
And so we're a part of this effort, which, you know, was housed here, but across the country, to make us more like that more perfect union. And bringing it back to Quince Orchard, I feel like it was those experiences that were helpful in guiding a small little church that was trying to figure out how to survive. And so maybe you could just help us with Pleasant View, as Pleasant View was struggling with its, you know, what was going to happen, what was going through your mind back at that time period when Pleasant View was struggling with its future?
It had everything to do with it. And let me tell you how it happened. There was the Washington Conference, all black, the Baltimore Conference, white. And then they came together and merged. And it was at that period that those three churches were in the Washington West District. And that is when I made the determination. This is an excellent time that I can use my experience to bring these three churches together. And I said, I can make it happen. I have the experience to make it happen.
And was there resistance?
No, surprisingly. Um, I'm trying to think of his name, Reverend Carter, who was the minister before Doug Horton,
Yep.
because he'd come from Tennessee. And he talked to Reverend Barrington, who was the out minister at the time. And he was talking about having the boys from the church. And I think they had some kind of a group, I guess, what do they call it, Boy Scouts? And he was surprised because he talked to people in his church and discovered that they would be glad to have people from Pleasant View to come in and join them. And that's really actually how the whole thing started. But the point was that after that merger of the Baltimore and Washington conferences, I found this an excellent opportunity to be able to bring those three churches together.
No, I love that part of the story. And what is often overlooked that I think you're making the point about is that there was an opportunity here. With the conferences merging, there was greater opportunity for interaction between these churches.
Exactly.
With the Boy Scouts meeting together, there was more proximity between these different groups, right? So that's kind of how it got started. But you talk about how intentional you had to be after it got started, even being so intentional as sitting in between different folks. Can you talk to us about what that meant, trying to integrate the actual space?
Well, the point was that we didn't want you to sit beside somebody you knew. We wanted you to sit somebody you didn't know. So to get to know them, then eventually everybody would know each other. That's how things happen. Because once you get to know each other, then you can find out how different you are, how that the racial doesn't matter, that you have so many things in common as human beings.
Uncle Tom, is that you make that sound so simple?
But it's simple for me now because of all these years experience. I knew after the core and that area, I had no doubt at all in my mind that it's possible, that it can work. So I saw it work. It changed my mind so much after I began to working with them to see how well human beings can get together. And the amazing thing about it was the respect. I can remember going to those meetings and there would be older Black people there, white, male and female, and the respect that these college students had for them. You know, the ordinary thing that happened back during those period of times, no matter how, if you're Black, it doesn't matter what your age is, you all referred to as a boy. None of that happened. These people, some of them not little education, but they're referred to as Mr. and Mrs. That's the kind of respect there was for older people.
So then the obvious question is, why are we still having these challenges today? Why don't we have the respect and people coming together?
If I had been able to tell my message at Martin Luther King's without restrictions, I could have told them why.
Give us the short version.
Yes, it goes back to the Civil War. There was a friend of mine who wrote a book. His name was Jimmy White. He wrote a book called The Uncivil War. He talked about the things that happened after the Civil War. For a period of time, things weren't well. They had a Black senator from Mississippi. They had one from South Carolina. They had one from Georgia, but he was killed before he took office. But during that whole period of time, the white supremacists, the Confederates, overturned all of that. By 1900, there were no blacks in the Congress whatsoever. For the next 100 years, nothing happened on civil rights. That's what was the point I was trying to stress when I said that truth crushed to the ground rises again. So when you see all the statues coming down, that's showing you that that truth that they buried all these years is coming to pass.
I think that's such an interesting point, Uncle, because so quickly after the January 6th insurrection, people were calling for reconciliation. And what I'm hearing you say is there can be no reconciliation without the truth, without remembrance, without real accounting.
Exactly.
So how did you guys accomplish that at Fairhaven? Talk to me about how practical I remember you telling me at one point that you made sure people's voices were heard in conversation. So take us back in time, and how did that practically work as the churches were coming together?
Well, I was at one point chairman of the administrative board. Those were difficult times. There were people who said many negative things. And I can remember on one occasion that I went to home with the minister, who was very, very upset. And I said, cool it, Jim, cool it. Let them say all the things they want to say. I want to hear it. I want to know exactly what they're thinking. Because if I know what they're thinking, then I know how to deal with it. We have here a unique group of people who wants it to work. And if we know what they're thinking, we know exactly how to deal with it. And that's exactly what happened. Some of those people left the church. Some of them would come to the meetings after they decided that they couldn't just interrupt the meetings and get what they wanted. They stopped coming, or they stopped objecting. And so then things began to move forward. We could talk, we could disagree, but never become disagreeable. That was part of the code. And so we worked through all of that. We would be there sometimes in the choir and hear some people say very negative things about us. We heard all of it, but we ignored it. We were like Jackie Robinson. We sit through all of it for the greater good.
Well, that's a lot of bravery and a lot of courage. One of the things that you just said, I think is so important, and that is some people left. So you made clear rules about that people were going to be able to be heard, that you were going to move in a direction, and not everybody wanted to go in that direction, and some people left, and that was okay. Today, we're hearing a lot of questions about how Joe Biden is going to pull in white supremacists. And I keep trying to explain to people that that's not his responsibility. What he can do is to create an opportunity for respect. And for those that are prepared to move in that direction, they will go. And for those that won't, they won't. And I feel like that's what the example you're talking about. It was okay for those people to leave. Is that right, Uncle Thompkins? That it was, or are you for, sorry, I can't tell if you're still there. Oh, you're still there. Okay. you frozen?
I'm sorry, I'm not.
Let me ask the question another way. So when you just were talking about the churches coming together, you mentioned that some people didn't want to go in that direction anymore. And so they ended up potentially leaving the church. And
Right.
that was okay. And so sometimes people are going to leave. And talk to me about that. How were you comfortable with knowing that some people were going to leave?
My point was new people will come. And that's exactly what happened. It was also a question that within that church, there was a lot of family situations. There were people in the church who had talents, but those talents were not used. One of the first things we did, that first board meeting that we had, was merge a white chair, a black co-chair, vice versa. So that every organization in that church was integrated. We had separate services, 9:30 for Pleasant View, 11 for Fairhaven. But our board meetings were going to be together, one board meeting. And that's the first meeting, that's exactly what we did. Merge the whole congregation.
I'm just always amazed at how intentional you guys were to have a black president and a white co-chair, a white chair and a black co-chair. I mean, just being so intentional at that level.
That's right.
Hmm.
Of course, actually, before we even came together, the Women's Society and the men's group were working, had been having contact already before that even happened.
Right. Uncle, talk to me about the drum major for justice. Martin Luther King died just as all of this was happening in April of 1968. And I know that, he was such a leader in the movement outside of Pleasant View, just in the desegregation effort and fight for equality. How did his death affect you? Do you remember?
Oh, yes. Yes, very much. I was here in Washington. Came back, well, we got the message at this meeting because we were in a meeting at Pleasant View at the time of his death. And I came back to DC and the place was on fire. Coming down 16th Street and 14th Street, fires all over the city. I cried. I never saw that coming. I couldn't believe it. All that struggle, I never anticipated that would happen. How can you tear down your own community?
I can tell that it still deeply affects you.
Very much.
Appreciate you, Uncle Thompkins, and the work that you've done to build up communities. And I understand that that's why when you see a community torn down, why it affects you so much.
Yes. Nothing was worse than to see the Capitol. Couldn't even imagine such a thing happening.
Tell me why. I mean, I know you've worn the uniform of this country. You've fought for desegregation and the integration of people. Why did the Capitol building affect you so?
I just couldn't imagine that people could be so disturbed that they would tear down the very foundation of what they claim they care about. It's like saying, I'm a patriot. How can a patriot do a thing like that? It was like the situation involved in the Civil War with General Meade from Maryland and Lee from Virginia. They both went to West Point. One fought for the Union, one fought for the state. Meade was very disturbed at Lee. Whether you know the story, do you know the story of what he said, his whole response to that? He seized Lee's property, not his home, but his property. He made it Arlington Cemetery. And he said to him, I will build the cemetery up to your front door. And every time you look out your window and see all these tombs, you will remember what you have done. How can you tear down the very foundation that you claim to support?
I feel like that's the point you're making about history, that if we don't deal with the history, it will rise again and play out. And that is exactly where this truth and reconciliation and atonement fits in.
Exactly.
Uncle Thompkins, as we're wrapping up, I want to give you an opportunity, because imagine that people from all over Montgomery County are going to have an opportunity to hear this. What advice would you give them, given where we are as a community, as a country, you know, from your life experiences? What advice would you give?
Never give up hope. That's what Martin would. He would be very happy, as you know, from those two people in Georgia. Nonviolence works. Just as it worked in the civil rights movement, is working now and will work. I think it will take us there. And I think the young people, this generation, will take us there and remove this racism from our country. Now is the time to do it.
And what can people learn from the Fairhaven Pleasant View story?
The beloved community where everybody's welcome.
Keep talking in that vein. I want you to tell me why. Why is the beloved community, or everybody being welcome, why is that important?
Because we recognize as human beings that we can learn to live together. It is possible, but you have to work at it.
Not everybody wants to work that hard, Uncle Tompkins.
I know, I know.
Oh, all right, I'll give you opportunity for the last word. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't?
I think you did pretty well.
Oh, thank you. I just, you have such a tremendous story. And forgive me for butchering which war. But let me say this, because I don't often have the opportunity. Often it's with grandma or with dad, but you know, my interest in our family's story, that of Pleasant View and Fairhaven and Quince Orchard and Gary Green, I have been blessed because so much of that story was already captured and preserved. And that was done by people like you, being the secretary of the trustee board for Pleasant View for so many years. You have ensured that when it was time, when I was finally ready to go looking for that history, it was there. You've been a wonderful resource for me and always willing to engage in another conversation or interview. So let me just thank you for that and show my appreciation for all that you've done, not just for the family, but for the community, and that we will continue to carry forward the good works that you have done.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Uncle. Appreciate
You're
it.
right.
I'm
Got
joining.
to
Say that again. Wait.
got to know you better.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.